Right. So it is night 3 or flood night 2, depending on how you want to think about it. And I'm thrilled, excited to be here. Like I was saying this morning, if you were here for our Sunday morning service, I was sick all this last week, which I'm fine now. I'm well past it, but missed school for 3 or 4 days and missed a really cool event in Kansas City that I was supposed to go to that I was pretty excited about. But what I was really excited about was tonight. So I'm thrilled to be upright and ready for tonight and not sick. So I just want to open in prayer, and then we'll get right to it. Heavenly Father, thank you so much, Lord, for the opportunity that we have here tonight to just dive into your word and into the science of the world that you've made and into the evidence that you've left us, Lord, to just confirm that you are exactly who you say you are, Lord. And we know that we don't need every little detail confirmed because we have faith in you. But it's wonderful, Lord, to have in this time that we live in where we're such a information-hungry people, Lord, and so many people in this world are so confused and so misled that you have made provision in these days that all this evidence could come to light and just help confirm the validity of your word. And we just pray that that's clear tonight. I just pray that every word out of my mouth is a word that you want spoken the way that you want it spoken. I just pray that you speak to all of our hearts tonight. I ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, well, I appreciate everybody that's here. It seems like every week I see pretty much the same faces and a couple new ones too, and I think that's fantastic. I'm excited about it. So we'll get right into it. Last week we talked about kind of the science of the flood, sort of laid the bed for all the stuff that we want to talk about tonight. So I do want to recap that just to make sure in case you weren't here or, you've slept since then. So I want to just kind of recap that. There's also always that chance that the way I presented it wasn't entirely clear. Maybe something didn't fall into place like it should have. So just to kind of get everything sort of in view where it should be, just kind of as a recap. So we talk about, all through this series, we talk about the secular world, meaning it's not a Christian perspective, and then our Christian perspective on how everything got here. So as far as the secular world is concerned, the earth is somewhere in the ballpark of 4.5 billion years old, and that number is kind of made up and sort of pseudo-scientific, kind of a little quick history of how we date things. So we, for thousands of years, just trusted that what the Bible said was true. And up until about the Enlightenment, that's what we did. We just kind of assumed that what the Bible said was true. And then there was enough kind of new philosophy that people were looking for other explanations, alternative explanations. And, you can really get into the history of all that and Galileo bonking heads with the church and, all that kind of stuff. But the point is, we started to look for other ways to figure out how things might have come. And it's a birth of a philosophy that we call uniformitarianism, which is a lot of syllables, but all it means is things are uniform. Things don't change. So whatever we see, whatever we can observe today, how it is right now must be how it has always been. The composition of the atmosphere today is the composition it has always been. The way that things behave and erode and weather and gravity and all this stuff has to be a constant. And that's not a crazy idea, but it makes it impossible for certain things to make sense. So anyway, uniformitarianists look around and say, well, how did all this get here? When we look at a cutaway of the earth and we see all these rock layers, where maybe a river has washed something out. How did all those layers get here? Well, I've never seen those just happen overnight, so they must have happened over a period of thousands or tens of thousands of years. And so our initial guess, and it is just a guess, was that, the world must be tens of thousands of years old at least, something like that. And it's just a total shot in the dark guess based on the observation. And then Darwin came along in the 1800s and said, you know what, I really think that critters turn into other critters over time. I'll bet that all life on Earth started from a common ancestor, and, single cells became multi-cells, became tadpoles, became fish, became donkeys, became whales. I don't know. Doesn't matter. That just has to take probably tens of millions of years for that to happen. And again, that's a shot in the dark guess. I bet it probably took tens of millions of years. I've said in previous apologetics series that I've taught, the scientific world's explanation for things is usually abracadabra millions of years or abracadabra billions of years. If it doesn't make sense, just add a billion years, close the lid, shake thoroughly, and it'll be fine. It'll all make sense then. And of course, that doesn't really work. But anyway, that's what Darwin said. And then radiometric dating comes along, and we get to extend the life of the Earth even longer. So somebody said, I've noticed radioactive things lose their radioactivity over time. They slowly change from one material into another material. And we talked about the fact that like uranium becomes radon and carbon becomes nitrogen over time. If we had an item and we know how much uranium is in it and we know how much radon is in it, and we assume that all of that radon came from the uranium, and we know, and there's giant, massive air quotes around the word know there, how long it takes a quantity of uranium to become a quantity of radon, then we can assume how old that rock might be. And that's where we get to the 4+ billion-year-old Earth, because there are certain elements in the ground that they can measure the date of, and they get that really, really long time scale. Okay, we're still here in the Christian world firmly believing in a 6,000-year-old Earth that the Bible tells us is the case. Now, I don't think I've said this apologetics batch. I will say this: there are a lot of good Christian people who believe in an old Earth, and I think that Christians can get along whether or not we believe the Earth is old or young. My issue from my own Christian walk, just for myself, accepting an old Earth is that, to me, it puts into question parts of the Bible that I just don't feel comfortable with putting question in. If the Earth is old, then death has to precede sin. And I cannot reconcile that. Yeah. So the Bible tells us the wages of sin is death. Every indication that we get from the Garden of Eden is that God created life that was not intended to end. Those lives were intended to be permanent. It was not until man sinned that death entered. So I cannot reconcile an old Earth and an evolutionary timeline with what the Bible tells me, because it just doesn't work. And I can't reconcile that. Still, yet, I think that, even if everybody in this room, if we all collectively agree, yeah, I believe the Bible. I believe that the Earth is 6,000 years old. Yeah, me too. But we can still get along with people who have different perspectives. And I don't know that it's a matter that's, like your soul hangs in the balance or something. But I don't want to take any word of the Bible and question it at all. I believe every single word of it, even the literal bits about the early how we all got here stuff. I think it's really important to believe exactly what the Bible says. Okay, so the way that we then attacked kind of this secular view said there's a number of problems with this dating method that they've come up with. Aside from the fact that, to begin with, all the numbers were just completely made up in the first place. But here's kind of some systematic problems that we talked about last time. Rock layers are really neatly stacked one on top of another. So we can look at a washout, something even like the Grand Canyon. You can look at these rock layers, and every one of those layers has a name and a supposed date range. They say, this layer here is 120 to 180 million years old, and that's the Schmirkebersch layer, or whatever, I don't know. And you can see that layer there, and then over on the other side of the continent, you can see that same layer. And what's interesting is its thickness really doesn't vary all that much across an entire continent. And really, the top of that layer and the bottom of that layer are relatively flat, which is interesting. If indeed those layers took millions of years to lay down, one would think it would change in topography. Like, wouldn't you think it would weather? Wouldn't you think that rain would wash some of it out, that it would have little crevices and rivulets and, fractures and stuff in that surface because of all that time that would have passed? And yet there is no evidence of that in any layer anywhere. Makes a lot more sense that these are washes of flood deposit that laid down nice and neat. And we find even more evidence of that if you peel back to the top of one of those layers. What you often find, and you and I are not geologists and soil scientists and stuff to be able to completely understand all this, but the way that the patterns on the top of those rocks are, to a trained eye, and in fact, this was a study that I referenced last time, in the last 20-some years, they've actually scientifically tested and proven the patterns on the tops of all these sedimentary rock layers that we see in our earth literally have to fall out of a water suspension, and that water, which we all agree on that, the secular world also says, oh yeah, it's settled out of water. It's settled out of a stagnant pool that sat there for like 10 million years. It can't have done that because they have proven through repetitive experiments with this that those kinds of patterns form when water is moving more than a certain number of centimeters per minute. It has to be flowing pretty rapidly, and that stuff falls out of suspension and it creates these patterns. And the patterns are so understandable. They're like thumbprints. Not only can you tell that they came out of moving water, but you can tell, generally speaking, about how fast that water was moving and in which direction it was flowing. And as we'll kind of talk about a little bit tonight, it's great evidence of how the flood came in and went out, which is really, really awesome. And it totally correlates with what the Bible's telling us, and it doesn't, there's nothing in there that doesn't match up with what the Bible says. It's also true that another issue with this secular dating method that we talked about last time is that in the secular world they say, okay, well, this isotope of uranium or whatever has decayed into this other material, and that tells us, oh, well, that rock is 3 billion years old. Okay, well, one of the major problems with that is that we don't know that the decay rates are constant. We can't say that we've got them really that finely dialed in to be able to measure them that accurately anyway. And all of these materials, especially uranium, are incredibly water soluble. If you put anything in water over a period of time, it's going to have a massive effect on whatever that material was. The entire ground gets completely saturated with water all the time. And that means that the amount, keep this in mind, the way we're trying to date the rock, we know how much, we'll say uranium, how much uranium is in it, and we know how much radon is in it. Uranium becomes radon. Here's the problem. Water will wash the uranium right out of the rock, and it will wash the radon out, and it will wash them out at different rates, which you got to know makes it really hard to do this dating. How could you possibly, you've got two moving targets that are moving at different speeds over an indeterminate amount of time, and we're going to put a pin on that and say, that's that many years old, and we can say that with certainty. That doesn't make a lot of sense. There's no way to think that this is not a closed system. There's water and material coming in and out of the system all the time, and that makes it really, really tricky to try to date with that kind of a technology. It's also true that if we have a geologic event like an earthquake, something where the ground is kind of in motion, or magma, lava is involved, or extreme heat, it can reset those radiometric clocks. It changes the arrangement of those materials, and the dating doesn't work out there either. It's also true that once we find a fossil in a particular rock layer, and we say, oh, well, okay, because of this location, because there's this rock layer under here, and there's this rock layer right here, and this fossil's in here, then we know, let's say it's a Triceratops. We know that Triceratops is somewhere between 83.5 and 66 million years old. That's an actual date for a Triceratops. That's what they think. That's what Triceratops is. Well, the next time we find a Triceratops skeleton, we just automatically assume that that layer that it's in must be that age because it was determined to be that age somewhere else. So once the date has been determined in one spot, it's just kind of universally applied anywhere else it might be found. And to not completely, totally make this terribly confusing, but also you just don't ever find a whole Triceratops. You know, you find a few bones and they're like, I think these are Triceratops bones. And then 3 miles away, they find some other bones. Like, I'm pretty sure those are Triceratops bones too. That was probably all just one critter, and just kind of reassemble. Okay, well, which of those rocks are we using for the date? Whichever one you want, really. Whichever one conveniently lines up with your preconceived idea of how old it was supposed to be. It's so complicated. All this stuff is a much bigger mess. It's not as tidy as you might be led to believe it is what I'm trying to say. Okay, and then of course, the big thing, the nail in the coffin as far as I'm concerned, is that there are no transition fossils at all between these layers demonstrating that anything ever evolved from one thing into any other thing. It is true that the very lowest layers contain really simple, like shallow water marine fossils, and as we go up, you get bigger life forms. Whether or not they're more complex is kind of almost a ridiculous argument. I mean, trilobites, which kind of look like trapezoidal roly-polies, if that makes sense. Is that a decent explanation? That live on the bottom of the sea. Trilobites go way back. They're like almost, not the very bottom layer, but like the next to bottom layer of fossils. There's nothing not complicated about a trilobite. It's as complicated as a hamster. It's as complicated as a bald eagle. So call it what you want. They'll sometimes say, oh, these are simple life forms. Not really. They're really not. They're not a, mastodon or something, but I don't think they got just as many parts. So it really goes to show there's something else going on here, because this whole idea of one thing evolving into another just doesn't work. We don't have any half bird, half dinosaurs. We don't have any half fish, half whales. And when they show you skeletons that they say, oh, look, here is a progression. They do have one where it's supposed to be this land thing that slowly became a whale. You have to really use your imagination to say this set of bones and this set of bones. Oh, there's a clear transition there. No, there's really not. And later you find out that first critter that they started with, they're like, oh yeah, that slowly became a whale. That's a dog. And we know what that dog looks like because we found other fossilized ones that still have the hair and stuff. It's like, that's just a dog. You can call it whatever you want, and you can try to make it a step in your little imaginary ladder, but it isn't. It just isn't. So there are no transition fossils. And if you ever find a good picture of one where they're showing you transition fossil, bring it to me. I'll be happy to figure out why it's absolutely not what they're saying it is, because it never is. It won't ever be. I guarantee it. I have great confidence that whatever fossils you've been shown in a book somewhere, I absolutely guarantee they're not right, because there's no way it happened that way. I know that it didn't happen that way. So I have confidence that we'll be able to figure out what really did happen. Okay, so here's what we believe. The world is actually 6,000 years old. All of these rock layers, my side, the creation side, takes a lot less time to explain. The earth is 6,000 years old. All these rock layers are evidence of one flood event. Now, one flood event that happened over the course of a year and had a lot of events within that event, which we're going to talk about tonight. But one flood event, one massively cataclysmic flood event that laid all of those layers down. And those fossils that we see at each layer are not evidence of an evolving of species, but rather evidence of what parts of the earth were flooding and what critters were able and not able to get away from that flood. That's what it's really showing us. And it really works out that way very, very well, which it should not be any great surprise. Now, we have our issues too. So I talked about their issues, the issues that the creation folks have, or the secular science folks have, which is, they don't have any transition fossils. Their dating system doesn't work. Their rocks are too even. We have our issues too. We don't have a way to date the rocks either. We can't pull a piece of coal out and say, well, that's only 4,000 years old, and that's exactly the timing of the flood. We can't do that. But it is our assertion that they also cannot do that. They can say that they can do that, but their dating systems don't work. So we're on level ground. Neither of us really have a dating method that works. There are no human fossils for us to point to and say, oh, there's where the people died in the flood. But that's as much to the credit of the flood as it is, we would love to have one. We'd love to have some human fossils and say, oh, look, these people perished in the flood. But it's also fitting that we don't have them because they would have been the last to die, which means their bodies probably would have been exposed to the elements and would not have left anything to be buried and fossilized. And then the last thing, of course, what I'm going to present tonight is a theory, mega sequence theory. It is a theory. It's not proven, but just kind of listen to it tonight and see what you think about it. Okay, so we want to understand then what the one more thing before I go. Jenny pulled this. Oh, I'm not moving forward anymore, doll. Let me see if I can move forward now. I have lost the ability to advance my own slides. Oh, now I can. We fixed it. She fixed it. Okay, I just wanted to show you this because pictures are fun. This particular image, so this shows you, and I'm not going to go into a ton of detail about this, but you can see all the nice flat layers there, and they've all got names. I like Coconino. Coconino. That sounds like something I want to drink. Yeah, exactly. I don't know if it's Coca-Cola, if it's coconut, but I want some. And there's a hermit layer underneath it, so that's fun because I can pronounce it. So you see all these nice flat layers, and then underneath the Tapeats sandstone layer, notice how all the other layers are cockeyed. So we understand and believe the secular world has all these explanations for how come those layers are tilted and these other layers aren't tilted. And I don't even care what their explanation is because it's not right anyway. Here's the thing. That's the pre-flood earth. And when this cataclysmic flood event happened and it created such a massive amount of destruction and erosion and just tearing this world apart, it just stripped the entire landscape practically flat and everything you see above that. So that tilted stuff is pre-flood, and that nice flat, even stuff, boy, isn't that handy? How that's just a nice flood deposit, just right on top of that. That makes a lot more sense to me. Okay, so let's talk about the pre-flood world just a little bit. It's fun to think about maybe knowing what the pre-flood world looked like, but it also helps us understand just how cataclysmic the global flood really was if we kind of understand it. So the first thing that I want to make sure that I tell you about kind of this early flood world, each little point we want to make sure, one, does it make scientific sense? And then more importantly, two, does it make biblical sense? So one, probably the earth was originally one land mass-ish. There was a shallow sea between North America and Africa, and actually where we are right now was probably in that shallow sea or really close to the edge of it. It kind of came up to probably around about Missouri. So we were probably under kind of that shallow sea, but everything was sort of one big continent. And the reason why we think scientifically that makes sense, I showed you a graphic the last week or the week before. If you look, okay, good. If you look at like oil chemistry on the coast of Brazil and on the coast of West Africa, it lines up. Places where the chemistry changes within a few degrees of latitude in Brazil, those exact same changes are represented on the west coast of Africa. So it matches up. You'll find fossils in one layer of rock across one part of our continent, and then across, the ocean, you'll find those same fossils in that same layer. It just seems like the earth used to be one continent. Isn't that also handy that Adam had to name all the animals So it lines up with the Bible too. If God was going to parade each animal in front of Adam so that he could give it a name, it'd be a whole lot handier if they all came from one landmass. When Noah had to load them all up on the boat, that makes that pretty handy too. I'm not saying God couldn't have warped a manatee, or not a manatee, they didn't need a ride on the boat, but he could have warped a critter from one side of the planet to the other. But from my experience, and God doesn't change, he tends to use things that he already set in motion to do his work. He knew what he was going to do from the very beginning. And so he set all these things into motion. I got to believe that this one continent thing, that kind of makes a lot of sense. Now, we also know there was supposed to be, according to the Bible, no rain in this pre-flood earth, that it was watered from a mist that rose up from the ground. So there's this really cool phenomenon. This rock-looking thing over here on the left is called a stromatolite. And stromatolites are a combination of like a sediment material and algae. They look like rocks, but they are very much alive. They are incredibly rare on Earth now. Those are on the coast of Australia, and there's only a couple places on planet Earth where they still live. In fact, for a long time, people thought they'd gone completely extinct before we stumbled across some. Most of Australia is like completely without anybody living in it, so it wasn't like people were just looking at this stuff every day. The map over here shows if you dig down deep enough in the rock layers, we find stromatolites everywhere, as if this particular life form once lived all over the planet. And here's what's interesting. Notice where that life form is. It's right on a coast. They like it wet. They like it marshy. They like it damp. They like to be around springs and around moisture. And this tells us that the structure, the kind of earth that early Earth was, must have been very different and must have been very wet. So that lines up perfectly with the Bible. And it doesn't surprise me at all that when we dig down, we find a great piece of evidence that this little, almost a throwaway fact, really, it's like a little thing like, oh, and by the way, it had never rained on Earth before. Moving on. And then we find this really cool fossilized remain that confirms, oh yeah, that little throwaway fact, yeah, that makes sense, because these things only like to live where it's wet, and now we find them absolutely everywhere if you dig down to pre-flood rock levels. So that's really, really cool. So the other thing that we want to know about early Earth is that the plates had not begun to move yet. So I don't know how much you remember about school, but they probably talked to you about plate tectonics. Basically, the entire planet is a set of these kind of somewhat mobile plates. And all the boundaries for these plates are way out in the ocean. And wherever there's a plate boundary, there's a lot of earthquake activity, a lot of volcanic activity. Basically, you can take all the volcanoes everywhere on Earth, and they just make these nice little lines, and that's where all the plate boundaries are. It's entirely likely, by the way, Earth is the only planet that has plates that move. The only one. So far as we know, there are no other plate tectonics. So these plates were, for all intents and purposes, seemed to be in place and locked in until the flood event. And when God opens the fountains of the deep, it is entirely likely this is part of the definition of what that term means, to open the fountains of the deep. Because secular science agrees, probably to begin with, Earth the plates didn't move. And then for some reason we can't understand, they must have started moving, and we just can't figure out what could have set that in motion. And I know what did it. I know what did it. It was God. And he said, move, plates, get out the way. No, I don't kid. And so the plates started moving. And so when they did that, man, really crazy stuff happens, and crazy massive water movements and plates crashing into each other and stuff like that. So we'll talk about that here in just a little bit. Okay, so we got our pre-flood Earth all figured out. Make sure I didn't miss anything. There's a term there I'll get to in a little bit. All right, so let's talk about mega sequences. I'm going to move through this part actually relatively quickly because there's way cooler stuff to talk about on the other side of it. But this is sort of like what the progression of the flood probably was. We're never going to know all the details, but just by looking at the rock layers, we can make a lot of assumptions, not really assumptions, educated views of what this flood event was probably like, which is really exciting to me. So they've given all of these sequences a name, and we'll just go through them. The names aren't important, but it's just might as well use them, right? Okay, so the first one is the sock sequence. And in this sequence, basically, the rain starts to fall. And we don't know exactly when the plates really start moving. I don't know if God's got them starting to crack or something like that. Maybe things are starting to kind of break loose, but we don't really know it yet. Probably don't really notice it yet. So Noah loads all the critters up on the boat, and God says, all right, I'm going to shut the door. And God shuts the door, and then the rain starts to fall. And for some time, for days and days and days, probably the entire 40 days of rain, honestly, the humans on earth who are not in the ark are surprised at rain because they've never seen it before, and they're probably a little freaked out, but they're like us and like, you know what, just don't, it's not worth panicking about. Probably everything's going to be fine. And they probably thought that the whole time it was raining. It wasn't until later that things started to get really bad. So in this case, the shallow sea parts of the world are the only places where you're going to find any kind of real evidence that the flood happened. So what's going on is as the rain starts to fall and the water starts to rise just a little bit, the seas get a little bit angry, we're starting to get some stormy weather, and they're washing. I don't know if you've ever been to the beach. If you have, and it's stormed a little bit out offshore overnight, when you get up in the morning, you'll just see some debris on the ocean, from the ocean on the sand. Not, just seaweed that you weren't seeing before. There might be an odd jellyfish or a partial shell or something like that. And you're like, oh man, something happened last night. Okay, it's like that. And so like right around here in Missouri and to our southeast, there are these shallow marine fossils in the very lowest layers. They were the kinds of things that were affected by this first stage of the flood, because all this stuff is just living in these shallow seas, and as that water washes up, it throws some of that stuff up where it can't live, and those things died, and they got buried by the sand that washed up with them. Okay, so simple thing there. Then the next sequence, the Tippecanoe sequence. The way we know, I need to tell you this, the way we know each of these sequences happened is there's a repeating pattern in the rock. So there'll be a sandstone layer, topped with a shale layer, topped with a limestone layer. And that's like a thumbprint. Like, oh, that was one sequence. And then the water came down, and then the water came back up, and the process started over again. And you get a sandstone layer and a shale layer and a limestone layer. And then the water came back. And then when it came on, it did it again. And so that's how we kind of know this is probably a progression of time. And it's a theory, but it's a pretty solid theory. And what's cool is these layers are true on every single continent on Earth. Every continent. The only place they haven't drilled is Antarctica. And I'm sure they'll get there, because they'll want to know that too. But, okay, so we're seeing these rock layers across the entire planet, and they're repeating patterns. There are places where the rock layers aren't there, and that's because those places weren't underwater yet, right? I mean, that makes sense. And as it goes up, the rock layers are more and more and more pervasive until you get to the point where they're just everywhere, because the flood had gotten everywhere. Okay, so in the Tippecanoe sequence, there are some offshore tsunamis starting to happen. Probably one of the very first places to see massive plate movement was actually probably just off the west coast of America. So out kind of towards the Pacific Ocean, kind of that very active fault line there in California was probably one of the first places to see a lot of movement. So that whole side of the planet started doing something that the author of the book calls runaway subduction, which is really kind of a neat thing. So here's basically what happens. The earth starts to crack and split open, and part of the crust, it's starting to shift, like the whole plate wants to move. And as this plate moves, it starts to go under the other plate. And when it gets in there, have you ever seen one of those things where like you take a string and the string's got like 1,000 feet of string on the backside of it, but once you like tip it over the edge, it just goes and goes and goes and goes and goes. It's almost like a siphon effect where it just keeps pulling until every last bit of that string is gone. It's like that. As soon as that crust, that initial planetary crust, it's dense and it's cold, and as soon as it hits that hot magma, that low density magma, it just sinks like a stone. And it just gets sucked in. And so once that subduction process starts, it's going to literally just start jerking crust, moving it crazy fast. And I'll explain how crazy fast here in just a little bit. So this process is just starting, probably in only one or two places on the planet. But where that has happened, it's causing that crust is pushing massive waves of water. So somewhere out there, there's big tsunami waves happening. And that means that higher land levels are now getting hit, and the kinds of fossils we're seeing, they're all marine. It's still just affecting ocean critters, but now it's bigger ocean critters. It's bigger things that are being affected by this because the waves are getting bigger. And so it's starting to wash bigger critters up further on the land. We are still within the first 40 days of the flood. It's just rain right now. Rain and a little bit of crust movement. Kaskaskia is the last of these early phases. So this all fits probably within the first 40 days. And the waters are really starting to rise now. And for human beings, they're starting to get a little concerned because that beach wash up I talked about before. This last time my wife and I were in Florida, there was a really big storm off the coast. And we'd seen offshore storms before. And, like say, wash up a jellyfish, wash up a shell. We walked the beach that morning, and there was a whole dang tree that had washed up on the beach. I mean, a log like that big around. And, I don't know, 15 feet long. It's like, golly, it just washed. And it wasn't like right on the water level either. It was quite a ways up the beach. Like, man, it got crazy out here last night. These guys were waking up every morning and seeing massive stuff that they'd never seen before, critters that they'd never seen before, washing up on the shores as these offshore tsunamis are starting to crash. And they're probably starting to get a little freaked out. And the water levels are rising, and they're beginning to wonder, is this rain ever going to stop? And the bad stuff hasn't even begun to happen yet. It's not the rain, guys, that was really destroying the earth. It's what is about to happen. That fountains of the deep thing, which is really starting to take off now in this next phase, is going to get bad. So the Abraska sequence, continents move. You just let that set in for a second. Continents move, and they don't move a little. Okay, so the guy that wrote the book, he went to Alaska, and there's a place in the Kodiak where he said, check this out. There's these two layers of rock. We know plate movement happens. We can watch it on GPS today. It's very slow, but they move. There was a time. Now, again, the uniformitarian view is everything is the same as it's always been. Yes, the plates are moving, and they've always moved. And that's why the Earth is billions of years old, because it took, 100 million years for these two continents to get this far apart. No. We absolutely know that's not true. In the Kodiak, there's a spot where you can go up and put your hand on it, where the rock over a foot deep is burned. And it has turned into a glass-like crystalline state. And he said, when you look at that rock had to hit over 1,800 degrees to turn into that. Over 1,800 degrees. These plates were moving past each other so ridiculously fast that it was generating so much heat that it was burning rock a foot thick. That's how much plate movement we're talking. Not like Yertle the turtle here. I mean, we're talking like, and imagine as a continent moves, how much water is being pushed out ahead of it. And then that continent moved from somewhere. Like it left someplace, right? So there's a gaping hole in the planet somewhere. So in one spot, this thick, cold crust is just dive bombing into the core of the earth. And in another spot, the crust is ripped open and there's this big raw magma gap. And what happens there, all that magma is incredibly low density and hot. And if you know from science class, hot, low density things want to rise. So all this magma rises up and just pushes the ocean. It could push the ocean a mile or two up at once. As soon as that big crack opens up, this huge chunk of new seafloor basically just shoots up and just shoves all the water up like a mile, mile and a half, 2 miles, just burying stuff. So the Abrasca sequence gets nuts and all kinds of crazy things happen. We're probably days 40 through 100 of the flood event now, while this massive amount of movement is starting to happen. Okay, let me get into my notes here, make sure I don't miss anything. The flow patterns in the rocks that we talked about. You can see how much the water's moving. They're moving way faster now, and they're changing directions. So the continents were moving before, and now they're starting to rip in different directions. There is 2 times the sediment buildup over the previous sequences combined. So this is a huge event. The American Southwest is being pulled so hard by that subduction that the whole southwest side of North America has been tilted underwater as it's being pulled down into the crust, which is really crazy. The Appalachian Mountains are starting to form, and a mountain range known as the Hercynian Belt, which is in Western Europe. It runs from like Spain all the way up through Czechoslovakia. Those mountains are starting to form as this land's starting to crunch up. Huge coal beds are evident from this sequence because so much life is now being wiped out. And it's not just animal life, it's plant life, because so much of this water is now washing up on shore and all this seafloor is lifting and just dumping massive amounts of water. Lots of plant life is dying, and all of that will settle, because what will happen is, all that seafloor rises, but then it's going to start to settle. And there's going to be kind of an ebb and flow in this thing, and the water's going to want to recede back off. And when it does, all of that plant material is going to collect somewhere. And then when the next phase comes and dumps another big layer of sediment on it, it's going to squish it and start forming oil out of it and coal out of it and stuff like that. So that Abrasca sequence is where things really get crazy. Really large land animals start appearing, amphibians, marine reptiles. An ichthyosaur, I'm going to show you here in just a second. This is a really cool one, I thought. There are 10,000 adult sauropods, which are like brontosaurus, kind of. Not that big, but, the big long-necked dinosaurs that just eat plants. They found 10,000 of these guys in one big graveyard in Wyoming, and there's not one young among the fossils. They're all adult, which is a great indication these guys were running from the water. And as they were stampeding to get away from floodwaters, the young got left behind. They got trampled underfoot. They got lost. And those bones are just gone. Those fossils are gone because they got washed away. And the adults keep running, and they keep running, and they run as far as they can go, and then something washes over and just drowns the whole lot of them. And all their bodies just kind of wash around and ebb and get caught in an eddy somewhere. And that's why we have a giant bone graveyard in a place like Wyoming. What kind of sense does it make from a secular world? How did all those critters get there? Oh, well, they all just kind of limbinged off into a lake, just one after another, and just piled up. No. And we also know if they did all jump in a lake, which obviously makes no sense, their bodies wouldn't have been rapidly buried. They wouldn't have been fossilized. They would have succumbed to the same elements that everything that dies succumb to. They would have been eaten up by other critters. They would have been eaten up by bacteria, and their bodies wouldn't be left. The reason why they're left is because they all died at one time, and they all got buried by a massive amount of sediment from a flood event that covered the whole planet. That's what happened. So check this out. Great evidence that the flood happens rapidly. That is an ichthyosaur, which is like a dinosaur fish, basically. Can you see what's hanging out the back here? That is a baby ichthyosaur. She was in the middle of live birth when she got buried. She didn't die and lay down on the bottom of the ocean and wait patiently to get slowly buried over 1,000 years. She was rapidly buried. And that's just one case of many where they find They find fossils that have lots of remains in their stomach, or unborn young, or half-born young, and stuff like that. It's evidence that all of this burial, all of this deposition of the fossil was incredibly, incredibly fast. And we know it has to be fast. It has to be fast, or it wouldn't have been fossilized in the first place. But this isn't something that gets talked about, in your high school geology textbook or something like that, because it's not convenient to the secular story. In Morocco, a coelacanth was found buried with a Spinosaurus. Now, you and I may not know what either of those things are, but a Spinosaurus is imagine a long-legged alligator with a big sail on its back. So could it get in water? They think maybe. Like it may have done some time in the water and some time on the land. It was definitely built for land. It was long-legged, not like an alligator, so it didn't waddle around. It walked around. But it may have done some hunting in the water. But a coelacanth, which, by the way, is a fish that they believe to be extinct because they found fossils that are supposedly, 50 million years old or whatever, and then a fisherman caught one, and like, oh, I guess maybe they're not extinct, and now we catch them all the time. Coelacanth only live in depths beyond 500 feet. And I absolutely guarantee Spinosaurus don't hunt 500 feet. Ain't no alligator swimming no 500 feet down, especially with a sail on his back, right? Like there's no way. How did the coelacanth and the Spinosaurus get buried together? Because they died in a flood. I said this last time in Wyoming. Gar paddlefish, which are freshwater fish, are found with rays and herring and sturgeon, which are saltwater fish. But the secular scientific community call these freshwater forms because they need to be freshwater to go together. But we know dinosaur fossils, mammal fossils, marine fossils are always found all mixed up together. And there's a reason for that, because they died in a flood, not in some weird scenario. Okay, the Zuni sequence is the end-all be-all. This kind of takes us all the way up. This is the last from day 100 to day 150 of the flood. Things are nuts. The entire world has split open. Africa and North America split before. Now Africa and South America have split completely open. The Atlantic Ocean is being born. The North American crust is just plummeting into the abyss of the Pacific Ocean, and all this new crust is being pulled up. So what used to be seafloor or old continental crust is now new continental crust with layers and layers and layers of flood deposit being thrown down on it. And as I said last time, all of our seafloor now is new. All of what today makes up the seafloor is a basalt rock that is just born of the lava that we see still squirting out of the ocean floor today. All the evidence for where all this stuff comes from is right here today. We absolutely understand seafloor is being built in the sea right now. Why wouldn't we think all of that seafloor was born the same way? It was just born really rapidly in this flood event. Okay, so in the Zuni sequence, total chaos. Because of all of this massive amount of crust that's just pouring down into the mantle, that stuff's going to come squirting up out of volcanoes everywhere. And this is very special chemistry rock. So a lot of the volcanic stuff we see is old magma stuff that's been down in the earth for a long time. And that stuff, it kind of does what Hawaiian volcanoes do. They fume a little bit and they squirt some magma out, but it's not like blank out the sky kind of stuff. This crust, as it's dumping, has large amounts of silica in it, and it's getting a bunch of seawater mixed in it too. And so that's creating these big, massive, high-pressure bubbles. And as all that stuff comes up volcanic eruptions, it just blows out in these massive ash-rich explosions that just start blacking out the sky. So for the humans living on Earth, they're physically watching the ground they are standing on moving. They can probably feel it moving, which is crazy. It's just constant crashes and disaster and earthquake and just noise of all kinds. Rain pouring down, oceans raging everywhere, and just the sky starting to black out with massive amounts of soot and ash, and continents are crashing and starting to elevate. The Appalachian Mountains are being born as these suckers crash into each other. It's crazy. We know, because of the deposits from the Zuni sequence, the sedimentary accumulations happened crazy late. All this stuff is super, super late in the flood event. And we can tell that because it all lands on top. Everywhere on planet Earth has deposits from this sequence. Now, there are places, like there's a bald spot in North America, and there's a big bald spot in Africa, where there are no deposits from the flood at all, because it all happened so late. All of that sediment that did land, it didn't land until that very last sequence. It appears as though a good chunk of South America, a big chunk of Africa, were probably the high points on Earth. And those were the very last ones to go underwater. And when they did, they would have gotten flood deposit on top of them, but because they would have then begun to dry almost immediately, they would have been exposed to weathering almost immediately, and those places would have lost that element. So that's why it's good that we don't see it. And that actually makes a lot of sense. Okay, so this Zuni sequence dumps just huge amounts of sediment. This is what creates a giant 1.5 thick sand just hole in the Gulf of Mexico. So here in North America, what happened is when this last big, huge flooding sequence came, it just then stripped off a bunch of that last sediment to be deposited, and it just washes it all out into the Gulf of Mexico. And that's partly because the Southwest was still kind of turned under, so it couldn't go that way because of the way that the whole dadgum crust was tilted. So it lifted all this ground up where the Rocky Mountains are starting to form, and all of that sediment had nowhere else to go but to just wash right out into the Gulf of Mexico. And when secular scientists first went out into the Gulf to start to drill for oil, they see that sand layer there and this will be the sand layer like we see everywhere else on Earth. It'll be, a few meters thick or whatever. No, it's 1.5 miles thick because of all of that flood deposit. And it just, there's no explanation in the scientific world, in the secular world, for how that sand got there. Well, we know how it got there. That's flood wash. Okay. So I showed you last week, we see a lot of times rock layers that are all bent. They're not hard, broken layers of rock. It's like an entire layer of sediment that just kind of got warped. A lot of that happens right here in this Zuni sequence because now all of the Earth is now underwater. Even the highest peaks of Earth are underwater now. And that's not going to last long. It doesn't have to. The world doesn't have to stay underwater for long for all life on Earth to die. At this point, before this sequence hits, most of the life on Earth is already gone. It's probably just those higher order mammals and humans are the only life left, and they're clinging to the last high peaks left on planet Earth until big giant tsunami waves just slam in and just burst all of those living creatures just all over the surface of the water. And it's only going to take, a matter of hours for that to wipe them out. And so right after that, the water will start to abate, and all of those freshly laid flood deposits will then settle and bend, which makes sense. That's why we see those bent sedimentary rock layers. Okay. So then the last sequence is the draining, the seafloor continuing to expand, volcanism continuing to happen. So as this last phase of the flood hits, beyond the end of really the flood itself, this is when the water kind of starts to all drain back off. Those last sediments settle down in place as the water recedes off of Earth. Where did the water go? Well, as we said, the sea floor had gotten artificially lifted because of all this new magma coming out of the Earth's crust. And all of that stuff, as it cools, it's going to condense, right? Because that's science. Things start out hot and expanded, and as they start to freeze up, they condense and shrink. And so as that seafloor starts to condense and shrink, it'll also start to sink back down and pull the water level back down with it. Pull it down, like I said, maybe 1.5 miles to 2 miles. So all of that's going to wash back down into the ocean, and some of it is headed somewhere else, but we'll talk about that here in just a second. Thick ash clouds are still blacking out the sky. Probably 1/3 to 1/2 of the ocean seafloor still hasn't been made yet. It's still being actively made, even after the flood event is over. This is really neat. From Texas all the way up to South Dakota. Okay, so imagine you have a really dirty, like where you wash your car. And your car is just coated in junk. I mean, it's just gnarly. And you go to wash it off. What happens is when you pull your car out of the wash bay, there's big rocks close to where your car was, and then smaller rocks, and then smaller rocks, and then the sandy, silty stuff washes all the way to the edge of the driveway, right? Makes sense. So those rocks are called cobbles. And from South Dakota all the way to Texas, we find in the fossil layer all of these cobbles. And the secular view is, how did those get there? Well, what happened was glaciers came across, and then they melted, and then they left some of those. And then glaciers reformed, and then they traveled, and then they melted, and they left these there. And then glaciers reformed. And one of the things you'll find over the secular explanation for how all of this stuff that we see on Earth happened, it's not one flood event. It's not an ice age. It's multiple floods. It's multiple ice ages. They even think that the single continent Earth splitting into multi-continents, they think that happened over and over and over again, which is just like, how complicated does your explanation have to get? There's a principle in philosophy called Occam's razor. The simplest explanation is usually right. You know, you can make it as complicated as you want. It's like, well, if these 16 things all happened in the right combination, yeah, but then it could just be this one thing. And the odds are way better that it's just that one simple explanation. It makes way more sense. How did all those cobbles get laid from South Dakota all the way to Texas? The reason why the secular world believes that has to be multiple events is because there's no way that much of the planet was underwater at the same time, except it totally was. Right? Like it just totally just happened in one event. And all of that runoff that wound up in the Gulf of Mexico left all of those cobbles behind, showing exactly where all that water came from. Now, this is really interesting. What about the Ice Age? Like, is that a thing? Did that happen? Yeah. So not only do we have a really good grasp on the fact that an ice age did happen, but that God wanted an ice age, that he needed an ice age to happen. And this is so cool to me. To me, this was my favorite part. So before we get into it, here's what you got to know. For an ice age to happen, we need some components. One, we need warm oceans. Because for an ice age to happen, tons and tons and tons of snow and ice have to come from somewhere. So it's got to come as precipitation. Where's all that precip going to come from? Oceans vaporizing, right? So we think, the creation world thinks, that the oceans were probably in the mid to upper 80-degree range because of all of the volcanic activity. So all that new molten junk coming up out of the earth just warmed the oceans up. These warm oceans are dumping massive amounts of moisture into the atmosphere. An atmosphere that is drastically cooled by all of this ash. Yeah. And evaporative cooling. So the reason why you sweat and then you feel cool is because as moisture evaporates off the surface of your skin, it literally cools your skin. The act of evaporation drops the temperature. So as all this evaporation's happening, it's causing the air to become colder. So because of the evaporation, because of the block out of the sky from all these volcanoes, the earth would have gotten cooled off significantly. So we've got warm oceans causing all this evaporation. We've got aerosols up in the air from the volcanoes, and then that's creating the right environment. Now all we need is enough time for the snow and ice to accumulate, at the polar extremes. Now, when we say ice age, we are not talking the entire planet is completely plunged into winter. It doesn't look like Elsa's, fortress of solitude or whatever over the whole planet. What we're talking about is in places like Egypt, and isn't it interesting? I always thought it was weird that God keeps referring to Abraham's land as a land of milk and honey, because I've seen the Middle East and it looks pretty barren and awful. Like, of all the places I would want to send my people, like, this is, hey man, I'm setting you aside some pretty sweet land. Like, really? Because it looks better, like, over there. Abraham's Israel would have been way crazier fertile because it would have been so much cooler. There's a reason why there's a thriving civilization in Egypt thousands of years ago, because it was nice and cool. It was like Mediterranean climate in Egypt at that time. It would have been nice, cool weather and perfect growing and stuff like that. Okay, so it gets colder at the poles. It's cooler, but still warm near the coasts because the oceans are still warm. And it's cool for nice growing seasons around kind of the equatorial part of the earth. Science works out with this really nice. We find lots of barefoot human footprints all around the coastal areas. And that works out. So these people were migrating comfortably around coastal areas in their bare feet. They didn't need shoes because it was comfy, because the oceans were warm and the areas near the oceans would have been warm even while the ice age was going on. So they always show pictures of like ice age people in like giant animal skins, but they're still walking around barefooted. Like, I don't think so. Now, keep in mind, the volcanoes are still going, even while the ice age is going on. So the earth is kind of wetter and cooler. Then, all of this massive amount of accumulation of snow and ice that's happening at the polar regions is going to drop the ocean level somewhere between 200 and 280 feet. And if you go to a map of the earth where you can actually see the elevations and you can dial down the water level, you'll find that there's nice land bridges between like Russia and North America, between Asia, all the way down through like the Philippines and stuff like that. The only place on planet Earth that's not really conveniently attached by land, if you just lower the oceans a little bit, by an ice age, is Australia. And we'll talk about it here in just a minute. So when the flood is over and God says, okay, Noah, it's time to get off the boat. And Noah goes to get off the boat. God says, now I want you to repopulate the earth. Get it going again. So God's command to his people is spread out and repopulate the earth. Time's ticking because the oceans aren't going to stay low forever. I've got this ice age in place, cooling everything off, making it convenient for you to relocate. Get on it, doggone it. And what do the people do? They don't go anywhere. They congregate in the land of Shinar, where they start building a tower to their own greatness. So we understand the Tower of Babel is frustrating to God because it's his people being proud instead of honoring him. But it's also, how does God punish them? He makes them scatter. But he'd asked them to scatter already, and they just weren't doing it. So to me, this takes this whole flood science and ice age science thing and lines it right up with the Bible so conveniently. It makes Abraham's land of milk and honey make so much more sense. It makes Egypt's civilization make so much more sense. And it makes sense why God was in such a hurry to get those people moving. Not only am I going to punish you for your pride, but I'm going to force you to move, because you've only got so many years before the weather changes and the oceans start to rise, and you won't be able to conveniently get to those other continents that are now becoming more separate every day, right? So what's really cool is, so Australia is not conveniently connected by land. But here's something really interesting. You know, the largest mammal in Australia, the largest animal, is a red kangaroo. And they get about 6 foot tall. The one continent you could not conveniently walk to didn't have any huge critter that would have a hard time getting there on it. I think that's awesome. Which means the critters that did arrive in Australia could have easily done it by floating debris and swimming and as close as they could get, because they probably got pretty darn close to Australia by the land that was there. But it might not have got them quite all the way, and that explains, well, why don't we have elephants in India, and that's not that far from there. We have tigers and stuff right there in India and China and Southeast Asia. Why didn't they make it to Australia? Tigers aren't real big fans of swimming distances in water. They can do it, but it's not like something they really enjoy doing. Did you know kangaroos actually really like swimming a lot, and they're really good at it? Isn't that interesting? And a lot of the things in Australia are aquatic, and they'll all kill you. Australia is like everything can kill you in Australia. But it's a lot of small things that are pretty mobile. I mean, platypi. There's something that gets somewhere by swimming, right? So that actually works out really, really good. So I think that's so fascinating. So not only did an ice age happen, yeah, it absolutely happened. And that means that the glaciers that we still see today make a lot of sense, because they've only would have had to be there, for maybe 3,000 years or so, because the scientists that calculate all this stuff and program out how long it would have taken the continents to move, and all, they're saying this ice age probably lasted a good 500 years maybe after the flood is over. And again, not a total blackout, chilled out Earth, but just a more comfortable Earth, honestly, which means all this climate change stuff we're worried about a slightly warming Earth, it's probably flood leftover. We know the Earth was way warmer before, because every indication is that it was. There's tons and tons and tons of plant life we find from the pre-flood Earth that gives us the indication the Earth was warm. It was palms and stuff, warm weather looking stuff. A lot of critters that seem to like hot climates, lizard looking things. Not as many mammals. So the ice age after the flood was conveniently cool, and we've kind of slowly warmed since then. And the plate movement we still experience today is just that little bit of leftover plate movement that we would expect as all of these processes kind of slow down, and it may never completely stop. And the Earth slightly gets a little bit warmer as time goes on, and I'm not too worried about it, and I don't think you should be either, because God said he's going to destroy the whole dadgum planet in fire anyway. So I think a warmer Earth is something we ought to be expecting and not be worried about. I'd be worried about it if I was the people worried about it, because I think they got some other things to worry about. Okay, so one last little tidbit here. Oh, I already covered that. Babel and bridges and repopulation. Oil and coal. So what we can learn about oil and coal. So this is just some more little scientific pin it down that, we're probably right about all this stuff. So oil is often found trapped in anticline domes. So there's these big dome structures underground that will often have liquid oil in under them. They're sealed on the top by clay or salt, and then so there'll be a shale rock layer, and then there'll be this gap, and in the gap will be usually natural gas, because oil naturally wants to turn into natural gas over time as it breaks down. Natural gas is a natural byproduct. And so that natural gas builds up and it creates pressure. And you've seen on cartoons and stuff before, I always think of that old movie with James Dean in it. It's like a 4-hour movie. Giant. Thank you. When they drill, that oil comes out under massive pressure. Yeah. How long do you think it can stay under pressure like that? It's been under pressure like that for millions of years? Unlikely. I think it would have sprung a leak a long time ago if it had been there for millions of years. It makes a lot more sense that pressure had only needed to last, golly, it might only have been lasting for 1,000 years or less, because that oil formed and then continued to form and then started to break down and create the natural gas. It didn't become a pressure environment for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years after the flood ended, right? So it hasn't had to be under pressure for very long. The fact that oil still exists, we kind of alluded to this a little bit last week. It was once believed that we didn't have to worry about bacteria eating oil because bacteria just couldn't live in that hot of an environment. But we now know that in geothermal vents, bacteria thrive in environments over 250 degrees. So the same bacteria that eats oil should have eaten all of this oil up a long time ago if it were really billions of years old. It makes a lot more sense that it's only millions of years old. It also is true that that oil would have lost its volatility. If it was millions of years old, it wouldn't have the potency that it has to be a fossil fuel. Coal. So if coal formed in place over time, the thought process is plant material breaks down and becomes a coal layer. And sometimes a cataclysmic event is thought to be the cause. It's like a volcano erupts or a local flood happens or something, and all this material gets buried. And what we find in coal beds often is that there are trees that are upright in the coal bed. And so the secular world points to that and says, see, look, the trees were growing, and then this thing happened, and slowly over a lot of time, this stuff built up, and the trees just kind of died in place and got buried too, and we see their trunks kind of in this coal bed. The problem with that is the roots of those trees don't grow down into the layer below the coal bed. They stop at the same level the bottom of the coal bed stops, which actually is not indicative that the coal formed around the tree. It's that the tree and the stuff that became coal all washed into that same pool together. The heavy root wad of the tree kept it upright. And we know from the cataclysmic event of the Mount St. Helens eruption and other volcanic eruptions that we've been alive for, that some of that stuff that got relocated by those volcanic eruptions, there are trees that got completely moved and got left exactly upright because the tops broke off, the root wad stayed, and it kept that kind of ballast so that the trunk stayed upright. We also know that these tree trunks we find in coal beds are way too close together to be naturally occurring, growing, living trees. As you know from walking around in the woods, you don't have to squeeze between tree trunks because trees don't grow that way. If a tree's trying to grow too close to another tree, it can't get enough sun, it can't get enough nutrients, and it dies. And so trees naturally only grow with such an amount of space in between them. And what we find is that the trees in coal beds are not naturally spaced. They are unnaturally spaced because they've washed in there together. So those coal beds are not an example of an old peat bog that slowly became coal. They are an example of a flood deposit that just washed everything in there at one time. So those little pieces of evidence tell us all of this stuff that we're being told about this millions of years story just doesn't compute. There's not a single part of it that computes. And you have to wonder, why does anybody believe it? And the simple reason is the people who created the ideas needed a way out of a situation they didn't feel comfortable in. If you don't want God to be an authority over you, you need a way out. And to get rid of him, it's kind of like you watch a cold case file or something and you come to find out somebody murdered their spouse or murdered their best friend or something like that. It's like, how could you do that? They needed this thing out of their way. And they couldn't find any other way. They were stuck between a rock and a hard place, and they thought, well, this is the only way I can do it. And people have killed God. That's what they've done. They've just killed him to get him out of the way. But God don't stay dead. We know that. He has a tendency to rise right back up. And so this whole need to get God out of the way is the only reason these dating methods exist, because we know they are fundamentally flawed. Everything we talked about tonight, every single layer of dirt, every fossil in every layer makes perfect sense from a flood view. How else do you have 10,000 dinosaurs all in one pocket? In what world does that make sense? Well, they all just Jenga stacked each other up and crushed each other under their own weight. Maybe it's like that concert in like the 60s where like people died because they all crushed the door when the Rolling Stones showed up or whatever. Maybe there was like a giant dinosaur concert and the Taylor Swift of the T-Rex world was singing and everybody just piled in this big hole and they all just died. It doesn't make any sense. How did they get there? They got flood washed in there. Well, what flood could have done that? Probably the same one that scattered rocks from South Dakota to Texas and dumped a 1.5 mile deep pile of sand in a hole down there. Ooh, I got one more thing. I promise I'll stop. But this is really cool. How did the Grand Canyon happen? What makes the Grand Canyon so dadgum special? Why do we only have one of those on the whole planet? Okay, so I told you, the whole American Southwest was tipped down. So that means it wasn't until the very end of the flood that all of that started to level back out. So a lot of that sediment stuff is still pretty soft. And when that last sequence happened, it's actually after the flood is over that the Grand Canyon starts to form. So probably the very first flood water that started to drain off that direction because the plate movement started to slow down and that whole area started to kind of level out and the Rocky Mountains started to lift and that water started to dump that direction. It started to cut a little channel. And then in that period right after when everything's still cataclysmic and crazy, all that massive amount of washout generates that canyon. And it's a unique scenario because there's a unique amount of disaster that happened to create the Pacific Ocean. The Pacific Ocean is one of a kind. It's huge. That massive gap and all of that seafloor was created in the flood. So that's why the Grand Canyon is where it is. That was the last part of the planet to kind of level back out, and all of that water washes down. There is not a sufficient secular explanation for how that canyon could have been there, because any river should have been able to do the same thing any place on planet Earth that the Grand Canyon did, but yet it hasn't happened anywhere else. And here's a really crazy thing. The headwaters of the Grand Canyon would have had to go uphill to carve the Grand Canyon because there's a bump that I forgot to write the name down of, but it's named. There's a bump 3,000 feet high at right where the Grand Canyon starts. So the Colorado River had to patiently just like ball up, I guess, and whittle away a 3,000 foot mound to begin to cut the Grand Canyon. What makes more sense is that massive amount of flood wash off cut that slit so fast it didn't matter what height, what elevation anything was, and it probably cut it before that uplift started to happen. And so that's how that canyon happened. But that 3,000 foot lump upriver from the Grand Canyon makes any secular explanation for how the canyon formed completely untrue and irrelevant. I forgot to throw that in, so I want to make sure I threw that in there at the end. Let's see. I think there's something else. Oh, one more thing. So secular science and creationists agree. The Appalachian Mountains is one of the oldest mountain ranges on planet Earth. It's way older than Everest. It's way older than the Rockies. Every indication from the rocks says that that's true. Now, here's what's really cool. The Appalachian Mountains, not that high, right? If you compare them to Everest, you compare them to the Rockies, they're not that high. The current rate, uniformitarians say nothing ever changes. The current rate of erosion, and I'm going to get the number a little bit wrong, but it's every, 10 million years, it should erode 40 feet or something like that. I forget. Doesn't matter because it's not real anyway. But the erosion rate that we understand, we observe erosion happening today. And we say every million years, so many inches should be weathered away. We all agree the Appalachian Mountains formed way long ago. They are among the first mountains on Earth to ever form. Then if they've been here that long, they should have eroded to nothing. They are supposed to have been here for 500 million years. And in 500 million years, enough erosion should have happened to almost completely wipe the Appalachian Mountains completely out. By their dating, by their definition, the Appalachians should not be here. That's their model of weathering and their model of time. So where's the explanation for that, right? Like, it doesn't make sense. But if it happened early in the flood, I can buy it. And that makes sense, that it happened early in the flood. Okay, I think that's it. I think that was all my little side details that I almost forgot to throw in, which took me like 10 minutes over where I wanted to be, but I hope that's okay. Okay, so before we finish, I just want to make sure, because there's always this chance that I just ran right over something and something made absolutely no sense at all. Are there any questions, something that didn't make sense, or something that you would just like clarification on, or something I didn't touch on that you thought I would, that you want to know? Because I may have just forgot something important. Oh, I got two. I'll get you, Matt. Go ahead. Yeah.
You explained it last week, how it's coming out from the cracks.
Yes.
I'm still not sure how it gets from the cracks and those cracks.
Yeah, so the reason why is because it's happening two things at once. So way over on one side of the planet, it's still subducting. It's still crawling under on this side. So it's literally like a conveyor belt. Our oceans are literally like a conveyor belt. So it's coming out of a seam in the Atlantic, going right up the continent, going right off the other side, and dipping off into the earth. And I'm glad that you asked, because two pieces of science here that are really, really awesome, and I would be sad if I hadn't got to bring them up. So I'm glad that you asked. You can actually look at the temperature and density and kind of determine how long all that's been there, and it literally comes in waves. So you can look at the crack where it's coming out, and that's the lowest density. And as you go out, it gets higher and higher and higher in perfect bands all the way up to the edge of the continent. So you can tell literally how old that crust is. And it perfectly, it works out perfectly. Here's what's also cool. Where the subduction has happened, today, right now, they do this test where if there's like an earthquake on one side of the planet, they measure the earthquake on the other side of the planet, and they can tell by how those waves move through material, they can tell how dense the material is. It's almost like an X-ray, sort of. It's like a planetary X-ray. You use an earthquake as a planetary X-ray. And what they find is there's these huge, like 60-mile thick chunks of crust that reach down almost all the way to the core of the earth. They are still cold and dense. How has crust that's supposed to have been there for hundreds of millions of years been in that hot magma environment for hundreds of millions of years and not melted? It's still cold and dense. And it's still causing deep, deep, deep earthquakes. They just measured an earthquake in like 2021 or something like that. And scientists have absolutely no idea how that earthquake could even be happening. Like, it doesn't make sense. It came from so deep in the earth. But we understand why, because all that crust is fresh and all that stuff is still happening. That's leftover flood. Really, really cool. Yeah, I'm glad you asked. Yes, Matt. Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah, so Matt's asking about dinosaurs and people, and does the Bible talk about dinosaurs? It does. So this is cool. I'm glad you brought that up too, because there's another fact I would have hated to miss. I would have thought of it later and been like, dang it. So the book of Job, we all collectively understand, represents the absolute oldest story in the Bible. Account. Event, real history. It's not the oldest written book. It's the book written about the oldest stuff. Does that make sense? It's like the oldest part of our history that we know. Job never mentions anything about Israel or Abraham or the law or any of that, because he was alive before any of that happened. Job makes more mentions of snow and ice than any other book in the Bible, because he was living in the Ice Age, people. Even in the Middle East where he was living, he was seeing snow at times of the year, which is cool. Okay. Then, yes, the book of Job is the one book in the Bible that talks about the Leviathan and the behemoth. The behemoth is absolutely like a sauropod. It's a brontosaurus. It has a tail like a cedar, and it walks like thunder, it's a brontosaurus, man. A leviathan is a sea serpent. It's like a plesiosaur or something. And the secular world has a lot of problems with people and dinosaurs living together because they say, well, there's at least 60 million years between the last dinosaurs and the first people. Bull butter. People and dinosaurs live together. Why do you think so many people, every single continent, every single culture on earth has stories about dragons or serpents, big flying lizard things, swimming lizard things? Where did they all get those crazy ideas? I bet the dinosaurs that they saw. And there are places on earth where we do have human footprints and dinosaur footprints in the same layer of rock. And when those things happen, the scientific community refuses to cover the story. It never makes it in the book, but they are absolutely there. They're in riverbeds in Texas. And there was one the other day I saw somebody reporting, I forget where it was. Human footprints and dinosaur footprints in the same rock layer. There's nothing crazy about that. The fact that, St. George had to slay a dragon. Yeah, that's a dinosaur. People killed dinosaurs because they're scary. I'd kill them too. Except I'd probably be scared of them. So yeah, good question. Anything else? Yes?
Do you know anything about the growth area of the Sahara Desert where they measure it backwards from the growth and dust down?
Oh, talking about the measuring of the sand of the Sahara. Yeah, I've read some articles about how they measure the growth of the Sahara. And I'm not well versed enough on it to give you a really articulate answer. But they do say the advancement of the Sahara is speeding up. Okay, maybe so. I'm going to say all your dating methods are off because all these dating methods are calibrated on an Earth timescale that's absolutely wrong. While I believe they're probably right and it probably is speeding up, it's on a completely different scale than we're talking about. And again, what I always try to remind people when they talk about climate change or desert conditions or whatever, besides the fact that obviously God has it all in hand and I'm not going to worry about anything, we've only been keeping good, accurate climate data for less than 100 years. And what's never ceases to amaze me is the people who think the Earth has been here billions of years are more willing to bet they've got it figured out from less than 100 years of observation. I don't think we've got it right when I think the Earth's only 6,000 years old. Like 100 years doesn't seem like long enough to really make good assumptions. Now, part of the reason why they think that their assumptions are good is because, and if this doesn't sound dumb, they dig way deep down in the ice in the Antarctic or the northern polar cap, and they pull out a chunk of ice, and they measure the air in an air bubble. And they're like, see, the atmosphere then was completely different. We've jacked up. We're destroying the planet. There's way less CO2 in that bubble of air. You really think a bubble in the ice, 100 foot deep in the Arctic, has any bearing on the atmospheric conditions at some point in time? Like, that's crazy. Why would you think that? That's what they're basing their stuff on. And a lot of times this date, it's like, oh, well, we have this date on this thing. How do you know that? Well, so the weather from the ice core matches up with this tree ring. How would you know that? They don't know. What they do is they say, okay, well, we have an ice core sample that's supposed to be 3,000 years old, let's say. Or 30,000, that's more fun. We have this ice core sample. Oh, that's 30,000 years ago. And that year was really rough. And man, it was crazy that year. And let's see, well, this tree is 1,000 years old, and that's its ring. And then this tree that's fossilized, well, those rings kind of match those rings. That means these two trees line up together like this. They literally do that. They'll find tree rings on one tree that are like a certain thickness, and then they'll find a tree from like the bottom of a peat bog or something that they can cut open and look at, and they'll say, oh, there's 3 rings on this tree that are the same diameter as the 3 rings on that tree. That means these 2 trees go together like puzzle pieces. And so this tree took us back 1,000 years, and now this tree takes us back another 500, and then they find another one and another one and another one, and they just keep lining them up, and they create this time scale that's totally bonkers and made up. And they say, well, there's your evidence of the climate over time, these tree rings. By the way, trees can form more than 1 ring in a year. Did you know that? Also, trees can go a whole year without forming a ring at all. So this whole business is smoke and mirrors, completely made up. And so I got about as much confidence in the Sahara dating as I do in all that, because that's how they do it, because it's all they got. I got God, so I'm just going to go with him. Anything else? I want to keep you here as late as possible. I want to destroy your Monday. I want you to wake up miserable tomorrow and be like, I got some good Jesus, though. What you got, buddy? Oh, okay. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, he was talking about a place in South Dakota where you can go to a live dinosaur dig and actually watch them work on it and talk to them while they're working on it. We went to a place where they were digging up mammoths and stuff. Where was that at? Texas? Yeah, I was in Texas. Those are really cool places to go. And I bet if you tell them that you think that fossil is only a couple thousand years old, they'll really have a time with you. You could really have a nice talk. They'd probably run you out of that place with a broom. But hey. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, the Hell Creek Formation is what they call that. Yep. All right. Well, with that, I think we'll have a little prayer and get our way out of here. What, darling? Oh, what's next week? Yeah, that's a good question. She's always motioning things to me back there, and sometimes I understand the hand gestures and sometimes I don't. Next week is going to be potpourri. I have a lot of other cool things I want to share with you, and they don't all necessarily go together really neatly, so it's going to be kind of a grab bag of cool stuff. There is one, the core of it that I'm so excited about is a mitochondrial DNA study, and that may sound like, I don't want to even think about that. It's simple. It's not complicated at all. It is amazing. It just proves some stuff, and I'm excited to share it with you. But it'll be a grab bag next time. Okay, so we'll pray, and we'll get you. Oh, yes, darling? Yes, I can do that. Is that a live stream question, or is that just a question? Really simply, though, babies. Yeah, baby dinosaurs fit better on an ark. Did the ark have dinosaurs on it? Yes. Can you put dinosaurs on an ark? Yes. Baby dinosaurs, totally works out. We'll talk about it next time. Okay. And an egg, sure. What if the egg doesn't hatch? God told me to take it, so I ain't worried about it. The guy said build a boat. It had never rained before. I built the boat. It rained. I ain't worried about the egg.